Alfred Hitchcock once said that nothing is more terrifying than a closed door. A closed door is the embodiment of the unknown. And what could be scarier than that? Only fear itself. James Brown cursed loudly enough to echo across the empty countryside as his car crawled along a muddy dirt road, fate seemingly conspiring against him. Mud clung to the tires, the engine sputtered and stalled, and what began as annoyance had now escalated into maddening frustration. "Damn Aunt Claire," he hissed, gripping the wheel tightly. Why the hell did she have to live in this god-forsaken backwater? Aunt Claire, a distant relative James had spoken to maybe twice in his entire life, had left him her house. Now, he was on his way to see this unexpected inheritance. From what he'd heard, the house was in a village so remote it barely appeared on any maps. He wasn't expecting a mansion, but hoped he could at least sell this gift of fate for a decent sum and be done with it. When the car sputtered to a final halt, James cursed under his breath and pulled over at the side of the road. The house was further up, at the end of an overgrown path littered with dead leaves and weeds. It didn't take long for the place to come into view, and it was, to put it mildly, underwhelming. A sagging porch, peeling paint, and cracked windows greeted him. "What a dump," he muttered, trudging closer. Inside, the house reeked of damp and decay. The floorboards groaned under his feet, the walls were streaked with mold like cancerous growths, and the kitchen was a disaster. "Oh, for God's sake!" he shouted, recoiling from the rusty sink. "Cockroaches! Damn cockroaches! Hundreds of them!" Grabbing an old spray can from a shelf, he unleashed a chemical apocalypse on the scuttling insects. Cockroaches scattered, bedbugs crawled across the walls, and spiders retreated into the cracks. "Yeah, that's right, run, you freaks!" he yelled, continuing his assault on anything that moved. When the air became too toxic to breathe, James opened a window. The icy autumn wind swept through the house, stirring up dust, grime, and the pages of an old notebook lying on the table. He glanced at it, a child's journal. Inside were crude, innocent drawings, each carefully dated. October 30th, 1933, April 13th, 1935. Something about the dates felt off, unsettling. Uneasy, James tossed the notebook to the floor and climbed the stairs. The room on the second floor was just as dreary. A creaky bed, a wardrobe, a nightstand, and a grimy mirror. James felt his reflection staring back at him, but it seemed wrong somehow. He was about to leave when he noticed something peculiar, a door cleverly disguised as part of the wall. Approaching it, he realized it was metal, and the handle wouldn't budge. "Interesting," he murmured. "There's got to be a key somewhere." Heading back downstairs, he began rummaging through drawers. Old papers, scraps of notes, a rusty paperclip, some powder in a tiny bottle. But no key. Swearing under his breath, he slumped onto an ancient couch. The house was freezing, dark, and oppressive, but exhaustion was setting in. "To hell with it," he muttered, closing his eyes. "I'll sell this dump in the morning, and to hell with Aunt Claire." In the dead of night, James Brown awoke to strange sounds. A child's cry interspersed with the barking of a dog. The noise was so vivid it sent shivers racing down his spine. He sat up on the couch, groggily rubbing his face. "There aren't any kids or dogs here," he mumbled to himself. "Must be the neighbors, though what neighbors? This cursed backwater doesn't have any." But the sounds didn't stop. Worse, they weren't coming from outside. They seemed to echo from deep within the house itself. James stood up, his heart pounding harder with every passing second. He stepped into the hallway, the darkness swallowing him. Each creaking step reverberated ominously as he followed the cries, which grew louder, drawing him toward the second floor. With trembling hands, he flipped on the upstairs light. The room greeted him with emptiness, but the sound. It was coming from behind that hidden, locked door. Cold sweat trickled down his back as he stared at it. There was no doubt now. Someone was inside. "Hey," he said, moving closer to the door. "Hang on, I'll get you out." He yanked at the handle, pounded on the metal, but the door wouldn't budge. The sounds on the other side changed. The crying grew weaker, more like soft sobs. The barking transformed into a low, guttural growl that seemed to seep through the wall and flow toward him. "Damn it," he muttered, frantically searching for something to pry the door open. He rifled through drawers, looked under the bed, grabbed bits of broken furniture, anything. But nothing worked. The sounds behind the door faded, then stopped altogether. Silence settled over the house like a suffocating blanket, the kind that made James feel like the walls were watching him. His legs gave out, and he collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. His mind refused to process the idea that a child and a dog could be trapped in this derelict house, especially behind a locked metal door. Exhausted and overwhelmed, he fell asleep right there on the cold floor. The next morning, James wasted no time running to the nearest house for help. To his surprise, the neighbor's home was well kept, with a tidy lawn and freshly painted shutters. He knocked urgently, and an elderly man with a kind smile and a deep, warm voice opened the door. "Hello, I'm your new neighbor, James," Brown introduced himself hastily. "I live in the house down the road." "Welcome, James." "I'm Matt," the man replied. "What can I do for you?" "Well, it's a bit of an odd request." James began, feeling awkward. "Go on," Matt said with a grin. "The stranger, the better." James glanced around nervously, as if afraid someone might overhear. He lowered his voice. "There's a door in my house. I can't open it. But that's not the issue." He hesitated before adding, "I think someone's behind it." Matt's friendly expression darkened. "Someone? Why would you think that?" His tone turned serious. "Last night I heard..." James's voice dropped even lower. "A child crying and barking. It came from behind that door." Matt's smile vanished completely, replaced by a tense frown. "Come in," he said, gesturing for James to step inside. They settled on a soft couch in Matt's living room. After a moment of silence, Matt asked an unexpected question. "How did you come to own the house?" "It was an inheritance," James explained. "A distant relative, my Aunt Claire, passed away and left it to me." "Do you know how she died?" Matt asked, his gaze fixed intently on James. "Well, not really. I think her heart gave out. She was old." Matt shook his head. His voice grew colder, carrying the weight of an autumn wind sweeping through a graveyard. "She died of fear." "What?" James sat up straight, a chill racing down his spine. Matt spoke with such calm intensity that his words felt like icy shards piercing James's mind. "Your aunt always talked about the door, the child, the dog, and something else. We thought she'd lost her mind. Eventually, they found her on the floor, dead from a heart attack, her face twisted in terror. We searched the entire house, James, and there was no door. Listen to me. Leave that house before it makes you its next victim." Matt's words rang in James's ears like a funeral bell. He felt as if he'd been plunged into icy water. Muddled and shaken, he muttered a thank you, left the cozy house, and trudged back to his own. One thought pounded in his mind. But the door is there. When he reached the second floor, he froze in front of the mysterious door. It stood as solid and real as everything else around him. His fingers brushed against the cold metal. Gritting his teeth, he tried once more to open it, but the door wouldn't yield. Then he remembered the axe in his car. Grabbing the axe, he stormed back inside like a man possessed. The first swing landed with a dull clang, the blade bouncing off the metal as if it had struck armor. He swung again, and this time the handle cracked, the blade nearly falling on his foot. James stumbled back, breathing heavily. "Damn door!" he roared, clenching his fists. He refused to give up. Nearly the entire day passed as he tried to break through it. Drill bits snapped, hammers rebounded, saws dulled. The door remained unmoved, an unyielding sentinel. Desperation clawed at his mind. Wild thoughts of using acid or dynamite flitted through his brain, but he had no means to acquire either. Exhausted, he collapsed onto the bed, murmuring, "What do I do? How do I open that damn door? If I don't find out what's behind it, I'll go insane." By evening, hunger gnawed at him. There was nothing edible in the house, and the kitchen was overrun with mice. He drove to the nearest store, grabbed some food, and ate quickly before returning. Determined to try again, he went to bed, vowing that tomorrow he would open the door. But the night brought a fresh nightmare. James woke up to unbearable heat. Rubbing his eyes, he froze in terror. The room was ablaze. Red and orange flames licked at the walls, ceiling, and floor, consuming everything. From behind the door came the cries again, this time louder, more piercing. A child's voice screamed, "Mommy, save me, please!" But the fire blocked every exit. All he could do was press himself against the door, its surface searing hot. His body shook as the realization hit. This was the end. He closed his eyes, bracing for death. And then, silence. The heat vanished. When he opened his eyes, the room was intact and icy cold. No fire, no crying, only silence, heavy and oppressive, crushing him under its weight. "I'm losing my mind," he whispered, sinking to his knees. The next morning, James rushed back to Matt's house. "It's me again," James panted. "You have to come. Tell me if the door is real or not." Matt listened with a weary patience. "All right, let's go." Together, they climbed the stairs to the second floor. James pointed at the door, his voice cracking. There it is! Tell me you see it." Matt approached the spot, running his hand over the wall where the doorframe should have been. "I'm afraid there's nothing here," he said calmly. "What do you mean, nothing? You don't see it? You don't feel it?" James's voice rose to a frantic pitch, nearly breaking. Matt sighed, his expression filled with pity. "I told you, James. Leave this place. This house will destroy you. Sell it, forget it, and save yourself before it's too late." James absent-mindedly shut the door behind Matt, his thoughts seemingly miles away. He collapsed onto the couch as if every ounce of strength had been drained from his body. His mind raced. Was Matt laughing at him? Or was he truly losing his grip on reality? Exhausted, he sank into a heavy, almost painful sleep. When James woke, darkness had already descended outside. The atmosphere in the house was oppressive, as though the very walls were closing in on him. He knew he couldn't endure another night in that place. Hastily gathering his things, he left, locking the door behind him, and headed for the nearest town. The town was barely more than a village, but it had a hotel. The only place where he could spend the night away from the grim walls of his new home. On his way there, he noticed a library sign, which gave him a glimmer of hope. If something truly was wrong with the house, he might be able to uncover it, even if only through an online search. After checking into the hotel, James couldn't resist asking the receptionist about his house. The moment he mentioned the address, the woman's expression changed noticeably. She looked as if she desperately wanted to forget what she'd just heard. Her voice dropped and her movements became jittery, as though the mere mention of the house carried a threat. It took some coaxing, but the story she finally shared chilled him to the bone. The house had been built in the 1920s by a skilled carpenter, Mr. Corsten, as a home for his young wife. The couple was poor but happy, dreaming of a bright future. One of the rooms was intended for a child they hoped to have, but as the years passed, the room remained empty and despair took hold. Mrs. Corsten, unable to bear the sight of the unused room, convinced her husband to board it up, seeing it as a symbol of failure. Paradoxically, soon after, she became pregnant. Their joy, however, was short-lived. A fire broke out in the house, nearly killing Mrs. Corsten. Her husband saved her, but from that moment everything began to unravel. Doctors were doubtful the pregnancy would survive. In his despair, Corsten encountered an enigmatic old woman who claimed their misfortunes were no accident. The house, she said, had been built where no one should live. She offered her help, warning that her services came at a price. Blinded by fear for his wife and unborn child, Corsten agreed without question. When his wife gave birth to a healthy baby boy, Corsten was overjoyed. His happiness overshadowed everything, and the memory of the old woman faded like a distant dream. The first few years with their child were filled with laughter, plans, and quiet contentment. But when the boy turned 5, he vanished, without a trace. The parents searched everywhere, tearing doors off their hinges, calling out in the woods and fields, but no sign of him was ever found. The grief was unbearable. Mrs. Corsten slowly broke under its weight. Her eyes grew dull, her movements mechanical, her words disjointed. She claimed to see the boy in every shadowy corner of the house, to hear his voice, his laughter, and at times his anguished cries. Meister Corsten tried to stay strong, but soon succumbed as well. He turned to drinking, first a little, then a lot, until the bottle became his only solace. In the end, they boarded up the child's room as if trying to bury their past along with it. But it didn't help. The sounds behind the sealed door persisted. The Corstens' lives ended in institutions, she in a psychiatric hospital, he in a rehabilitation center. The house remained abandoned until James's aunt purchased it. Neighbors often said she spoke of noises. Children crying, a dog barking, strange scraping sounds behind a door that shouldn't exist. They thought her slightly mad, but harmless, so they left her alone. James mulled over the story, trying to process what he'd heard. It sounded unreal, yet the details about his aunt matched what he already knew. He frowned, scratched his head, and asked the receptionist, "How do you know all this?" "In small towns, everyone knows everything," she whispered, as if afraid someone might overhear. The night at the hotel passed peacefully. However, morning brought a renewed sense of unease. Determined to understand what had been meant by a bad place, James headed to the library. The librarian greeted him warily, at first refusing to help. But under James's persistent pressure, he finally relented. "Fine, I'll give you some newspaper clippings from that era. Just please don't come back here with complaints if things go wrong." James nodded firmly. "I promise." The old newspapers smelled of damp and time. The brittle pages rustled as if whispering secrets of their own. The initial articles yielded nothing of importance, but one piece dated October 24th, 1919, made James freeze. It reported that the town mayor, who also acted as the village leader, had pushed for the sale of a plot of land for construction. The residents had been against it, as the land was an old cemetery. The mayor dismissed their objections, claiming the cemetery was long abandoned with no living relatives of the deceased to care for it. He argued that the dead were merely dust scattered by time. The town needed money, and the village needed new homes. Superstitions, he declared, had no place in progress. James uncovered several follow-up articles about how the mayor had gone through with the sale, despite the public's dissatisfaction. The newcomers who purchased the plots didn't garner much favor with the locals either. But the most intriguing article James found was dated May 15th, 1921. It mentioned the arrival of a young couple. The Corstons, who had bought the plot, considered the worst on the old cemetery, a section said to be the burial ground of suicides. Elders had tried to warn them, but the couple ignored their advice. Later, the press feasted on the tragedy that befell the Corstons, pointing fingers at the mayor for daring to sell cemetery land. Closing the final newspaper and returning the materials to the librarian, James headed back to the hotel. His thoughts were heavy. He recalled stories about burial sites for suicides, considered cursed and often placed beyond the main cemetery boundaries. He dismissed such tales as mere superstition before, but now they began to take on a chilling significance. I need to find out what that door is hiding, or I'll lose my mind, he thought. Back home, James immediately began searching. He scoured the desk but found nothing beyond his Aunt Claire's old papers, recipes, gardening tips, and greeting cards, all utterly useless. He checked every corner of the house, hunting for hidden compartments or false walls, but again came up empty-handed. Then he remembered the notebook on the kitchen counter. It contained children's drawings he'd previously found amusing. Now, they seemed far more sinister. James retrieved the notebook and began flipping through it. At first, the drawings were innocent. Bunnies, cats, and smiling people rendered in bright colors. But as he turned the pages, the illustrations grew darker, making his jaw clench. Harsh, crude strokes of gray and black pencil depicted a shadowy figure, its form indistinct but menacing. The drawings became increasingly detailed, the figure appearing closer and closer with each page. The date scrawled on the pages corresponded to the year 1936, the year the Corston boy disappeared. The final drawing was dated October 28, 1936, the day before the anniversary of the boy's disappearance. After that, the notebook was blank. James set the notebook aside, trying to steady his trembling hands. He glanced out the window. The evening was deepening, the house enveloped in encroaching darkness. Time seemed to stand still, the silence broken only by the rhythmic ticking of an old clock on the wall. Today was October 27th, 2006. Tomorrow would mark exactly 70 years since the boy's disappearance. A shiver ran down James's body, and a cold chill crept up his spine. No, I can't spend another night in this house, he thought in a panic. Without another second of hesitation, he bolted for the door, burst outside, and leaped into his car. But no matter how many times he turned the key, the engine refused to start. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel, shouting a curse. But the car remained stubbornly silent, as if it too was bound to the house's curse. In desperation, James flung the door open and started running down the deserted street, not knowing where he was headed. It felt as though the darkness was chasing him, as if each step echoed into the void that lived within the house. But where could he go? Stranded hundreds of miles from home. Running seemed futile, knowing that every path led back to the same looming shadow, the inescapable darkness of the house. Soon, he slowed to a halt, gasping for breath. Realizing the futility of his flight, he turned back. By the time he reached the house, night had fallen like a heavy shroud, swallowing everything around him. Breathing heavily, James pushed open the creaking door. The house greeted him with an oppressive silence so thick it felt alive. The house had always been strange, but tonight something was different. The silence wasn't merely empty. It called to him, beckoned him upstairs. He didn't resist. On the upper floor, he stopped in front of the door. The door he had avoided since the day he moved in. "The cursed door," he muttered through gritted teeth. He pounded on it once, twice. It wouldn't budge, but the hollow sound of his blows felt like an answer, mocking, taunting. "I'll uncover your secret even if it kills me," he yelled, his voice echoing against the walls. But sleep that night was an unattainable luxury. James sat on the floor, leaning against the door, staring at an old mirror across the room. Its surface was clouded with streaks, reflecting little more than vague shadows. Above him, a dim light bulb swayed gently, casting flickering shadows like the rhythmic swing of a pendulum. Suddenly the light flickered, then went out. The room plunged into darkness. James shot to his feet. "What the?" His voice caught in his throat as he noticed the mirror. It was no longer a simple reflection. The room within the mirror was different. The wallpaper was fresh, the furniture new, as though someone had just moved in. But there was no sign of James. Instead, a woman sat on the bed. Her head was bowed, her fingers anxiously twisting strands of her hair. Then the door behind her flew open. A man stepped inside. The woman flinched, snapping her head up, her eyes wide with fear. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The man raised a hand as if to calm her. "Don't be afraid. I mean no harm. I'm here to help. I know you want a child, but can't have one. I can change that." The woman froze, stunned. Then a flicker of anger crossed her face. "What nonsense are you spouting? I have a husband, and he—" "Listen," the man interrupted sharply. His voice trembled, but it carried an unyielding determination. "Your home stands on cursed ground, land where suicides were buried. This place is steeped in grief, tainted by despair. I know you didn't know that, but surely you felt it." The woman's face paled. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sudden whistle of wind sweeping through the room. "Don't interrupt," the man barked, his tone faltering but firm, as if forcing himself to reveal something long buried. "Before the mayor made his fateful decision, something terrible happened in my life. I had a son, a little boy, my only light in this dark world. His mother died in childbirth, and I raised him alone. I worked tirelessly to keep us afloat. He was my everything, my reason for living." The man fell silent, his words seeming to choke him, each one an unbearable weight. The man exhaled heavily, his gaze fixed on the floor as if searching for the words buried in his memory. "One day, I was working in the garden, growing vegetables to sell. It was our only income. My son was inside the house playing with the dog. He was only 5. There was no one else to watch him, so he was left alone." His voice faltered, but he didn't let himself drown in the abyss of recollection. "Then I heard it, a gunshot, and the dog barking, a sound that froze the blood in my veins. I dropped everything and ran into the house. And there—" He gasped sharply, covering his face with his hands, fighting back the flood of emotion. His voice, though trembling, regained its strength. "He was playing with a gun, my gun. I'm an idiot. I left it loaded. He was 5 years old, and I ran into the house and saw him lying on the floor. Blood, so much blood, and the dog! It was licking his face, tugging at the wound. I nearly threw up. I grabbed the gun and shot the dog. It wasn't her fault, but I couldn't think straight. I blamed her. Thought it was her fault for letting him... The man stopped, his eyes squeezed shut. A moment later, he opened them again, shining with tears but burning with resolve. I nearly lost my mind. I ran around the house screaming, trying to think, to call for a doctor, but it was too late, and then I realized something else. They'd arrest me for negligence, for leaving a loaded gun where a child could find it. Panic consumed me. I couldn't go to jail. I wouldn't survive it. He was all I had. His voice grew quieter, haunted. So I made a decision. I buried my boy in the old cemetery. It was abandoned. Nobody ever went there. I buried him deep, so no one would know. I buried the dog beside him. Then I called the police and reported him missing. They searched and searched, but they never found him. The case went cold. Silence hung in the air, dense and suffocating. The woman who had been listening looked frozen, her face locked in an expression of sheer horror. "But that's not the end," the man continued, his voice gaining an unsettling intensity. "When the mayor decided to sell the land for construction, I couldn't sleep. Every day I was terrified someone would find the grave. And all that time I was unraveling, tormented by the pain of losing him. Then one night," the man's eyes flared with a strange light. "One night I met her. The old woman. She looked like she was made of shadows. She said she knew about my sorrow, that she could help me. 'Your son can return,' she said. 'He will be reborn to new parents, an exact copy of him. All you have to do is wait. Wait for them to build a house here. Wait for their despair to match your own, and then come to them. I'll tell you what to do.' The man fell silent. The woman across from him sat as pale as the walls, her mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. Finally she whispered, 'And what do you want from me?' 'Your consent,' he replied simply. James stood frozen before the mirror, unable to tear his eyes from the unfolding scene. It was like something carved from the depths of the most terrifying nightmare. Suddenly the image in the mirror began to shift. Now he saw the man and woman standing outside the house. The man held a shovel. "I'm certain it's here," the man said, pointing to the ground. "Then dig," the woman replied, her voice trembling like a branch in a strong wind. The man plunged the shovel into the earth near the house's foundation. The dull thud of disturbed soil confirmed that the ground had been tampered with before. James stood rigid, teeth clenched, dreading what he might see next. The digging was frantic, driven by desperation. Dirt flew in all directions until finally the man stopped, wiping his brow. "Here it is," he muttered, descending into the narrow pit. A moment later the man emerged, holding an old wooden box, darkened by the passage of time. The woman instinctively recoiled, as though the mere presence of the object burned her. "Come on, help me," the man grunted, extending the box. Reluctantly, the woman stepped forward to assist him out of the hole. They set the box on the ground, and the man leaned over it, cautiously lifting the lid. The smell. Even through the mirror, James could almost feel the sickly sweet stench of decay. The woman clapped a hand over her mouth, retreating another step. Yet her gaze remained fixed on the box's contents. At the bottom lay the remains of a boy, a small, partially decomposed skeleton. But something was wrong. The skull. It looked distorted, almost canine. James's eyes widened in horror. "This is revolting," the woman whispered, trembling all over. "I'm going to be sick." "Do you want a child or not?" The man snapped, gripping the box as if afraid it would be taken from him. "I do, but—" She faltered, her pleading eyes searching his face, as if hoping he'd abandon this. "Then follow me," he barked, marching toward the house. The woman trailed behind him, her steps hesitant as though pulled by an invisible chain. James froze by the mirror, watching as they disappeared through the doorway. His fists clenched, but he could do nothing but observe. He waited, expecting to see more, but suddenly the mirror's image began to fade. A faint mist turned to a thick fog, and finally, the glass reflected only his own face. "Hey!" James shouted, pounding his fist against the mirror. It didn't respond. The bulb overhead flickered and illuminated the room with its usual dim light. James stepped back, wiping his sweaty palms on his pants. "Damn it," he hissed, glaring at his reflection. Breaking the mirror was pointless. It might still show something. He retreated to the bed, sinking onto it and staring at the floor. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of the story into a grotesque mosaic. The old cemetery, where suicides were buried. The man who had laid his son to rest there. The Corstons, who built the house on that cursed ground. The woman's struggle to conceive. The man's pact with a devilish ritual passed down by an old crone. James tried to untangle the sequence of events. The ritual worked, but at what cost? The woman nearly died in a fire just before giving birth. The child was born, but the old crone had warned he wouldn't live long. She was right. The boy vanished after 5 years, and his parents lost their sanity, dying in psychiatric hospitals. James smirked, the expression bitter, as though he'd just heard a cruel joke. All of it, all this madness, somehow tied back to the cursed door upstairs. The door only he and his poor Aunt Claire could see. He remembered how she always said the house felt alive, like it had a soul of its own. Aunt Claire, what a place you picked. A haunted house, he thought, pacing the room. The clock read just past midnight. October 27th, the anniversary of the boy's disappearance. So far, everything was quiet, no screams, no visions, just an oppressive silence, broken only by the whisper of wind outside the window. James caught himself staring out at the dark, not knowing why, but his gut told him it was important. And then he saw her, a figure dressed in black standing outside the house. His heart skipped a beat. No one in this village wandered around at night, least of all near this house. James didn't doubt for a second. It wasn't a late-night neighbor. He leaped up and rushed downstairs, skipping steps. Moments later, he was on the porch, scanning the dark street. The figure was retreating, but still close. "Wait!" James said, leaping off the porch and sprinting after her. She stopped and turned around. It was an old woman. Her face resembled a skull stretched tight with yellowed skin, and her eyes were hollow pits of darkness. Her sharp, hooked nose, like carved bone, completed the horrifying image. A black scarf covered her head, with stray gray hairs peeking out, and her long cloak clung to her hunched, emaciated frame. "You!" James gasped, disbelief etched on his face. "Yes, it's me," she croaked, her voice harsh and grating like a raven's caw. You're the cause of all this." James felt anger boiling inside him. "You told that man how to bring back his son. You knew he wouldn't live long, but you did it anyway. Why?" The old woman tilted her head, her eyes glinting like black voids. "I didn't know then," she whispered, but James caught a flicker of regret in her voice. "Even we don't know everything." "We? Who's we?" She sighed, the sound like a gust of wind sweeping across desolate fields. "The souls of the dead," she said softly. "I'm a ghost. Long ago, in the early 19th century, I was a young, beautiful girl. We were wealthy with land, servants, everything. But I made a mistake. I fell in love with a stable boy. Handsome, strong, clever. I sinned. I got pregnant by him. For my family, it was unforgivable. A disgrace. My mother took me to a back-alley abortionist. But something went wrong. I bled to death." She paused, lowering her gaze before continuing. "I don't know why they buried me not in the family crypt, but here, among suicides and sinners. Maybe because I had shamed the family. But what I do know is that my soul stayed here, unable to find peace. I mourned my unborn child, my ruined life. Souls, like people, grow old. Over time, I became what you see now." Her voice grew stronger, her hollow eyes locking onto James. "And then he came, Roland. He buried his son on my remains, and that gave me strength. I was able to appear to him. I knew what to do to bring back his boy, even at such a price. I lost my child, James. I wanted to help. I wanted to give him what I had been denied." James listened in horror, a cold dread creeping over him. The old woman's words felt like the whispers of death itself, but he couldn't tear his gaze from her hollow eyes. He couldn't stop listening. She spoke of things that defied understanding, yet they felt disturbingly true. "Dark magic," she continued. "I knew this resurrected child would bear not an angelic mark but a devilish one. But I didn't tell Roland or the Corstons. I didn't dare. They were too desperate, too blinded by their desire for a child. And while I've shown you enough, the ritual itself must never be seen. It's too horrifying, even for someone who has witnessed so much. But when the time of birth drew near, I realized the Creator, the one who helped make this happen, would come for his creation. I could only delay the inevitable, buy time until the boy's life ran out. 5 years, just 5 years." James swallowed hard, his hands trembling, but he couldn't interrupt her. Her voice grew quieter, yet it pierced his soul. As the end approached, my unease grew. I even appeared to the boy a few times. He saw me and it terrified him. But he was already marked, restless, anxious. He cried at night for no reason, his screams driving his parents mad. The household became a war zone. The parents were exhausted. And the boy. He seemed to sense his time was short. He became increasingly demanding, throwing tantrums, never satisfied. One day, his outbursts lasted all day. He cried, screamed, and demanded attention. By evening, Mrs. Corston snapped. She shouted, "Shut up already!" and struck him. Whether it was intentional or not, the boy fell, hitting his temple on the edge of the table. Blood began to flow from his head. He lost consciousness. The terrified parents didn't know what to do. Meister Corsten picked up his son's body and carried it to the nursery. He locked the door and told his wife, "Remember, we have no son, and this room doesn't exist." She only nodded, but their madness had already begun. They forgot what they'd done, forgot that their child was dead. They convinced themselves he had simply vanished. They didn't even notice the smell, that smell of rotting flesh, sweet and cloying, the kind that makes your stomach churn. They didn't notice it. Not the trickle of blood seeping from beneath the door. Not anything. Mrs. Corsten wiped the blood away as if it were juice, and continued mourning her missing son. They locked that part of reality behind the door. And that's when the house began its work. The old woman paused, and James felt the air around him grow heavier. No neighbors, no police. No one saw or felt anything. They didn't see the door. They didn't smell the stench. They simply believed the child was missing, and that was the end of it. Only I was there. I saw everything but could do nothing. The devil's bargain had been made, and no one could break it. The old woman lifted her eyes to James. Her gaze carried the weight of centuries. And the rest you already know. "So, behind that door, the boy's remains are really there?" he asked, feeling a cold horror tighten around his heart. Yes, that's right. They've been there for decades. That's why the house is breaking, rotting, becoming a trap for everyone who lives here. Why can my aunt and I see the door when others can't?" His voice trembled, as though the question itself could summon something dark. "You are the inheritors of this curse. This house has latched onto your blood, and you see what others cannot." James swallowed hard, a question forming in his mind that he wasn't sure he wanted answered. "All right. Then tell me, how do I open the door? How do I bury the boy and end this nightmare?" The old woman shook her head, her eyes darkening as if reflecting centuries of sorrow. "It's not that simple, boy. This house, it wasn't meant to exist. It grew out of blood and pain. And it's not just me who lingers here. There's an entire legion of the dead, and none of us can find peace. The only way out is to tear this house down to its foundation. Level the ground, retrieve the remains, and bury them properly. Only then can you try to end this agony." James closed his eyes, the pressure around his head mounting. "Tear down the house? That won't be easy." But the old woman continued as though his doubts were insignificant. "Hurry!" she snapped, her voice sharp as a blade, burning him like a physical wound. "The 70th anniversary is near. Something is bound to happen. I can feel it. You have very little time. Hurry." With those words, her silhouette seemed to dissolve into the air, leaving behind only a faint, cloying scent of decay and damp night. James stood alone, stunned, his mind pulsing with one insistent thought: how to destroy the house? He lifted his eyes to the cursed mansion, standing apart from the village as though shunning the other buildings. With a heavy sigh, he went back inside, but this time he didn't dare go upstairs. Something up there was wrong. He spent the rest of the night on the couch, staring out the window, his hands gripping the armrests as his mind churned for a solution. Finally, at dawn, an idea flared in his mind. If it began with fire, then it must end with fire. Moving as if on autopilot, he went to his car, retrieved a can of gasoline, and returned to the house, forcing himself to ignore the sinister rustling sounds coming from above. His heart pounded so loudly it felt like the walls could hear his fear. Ascending to the second floor, he poured gasoline liberally, almost hysterically, focusing especially on the door that with each glance seemed more alive. Its cracks formed what looked disturbingly like a face. "To hell with you," he hissed, glaring at it, and then the screams began again. A child's wailing, piercing, and soul-shaking mixed with a deep, guttural growl like a dog barking from beneath the floor. "I'll save you, I'll end this," James muttered, a nervous, almost maniacal grin twisting his face, the look of a man teetering on the edge of the abyss. He turned, leaving a trail of gasoline behind him, and started heading downstairs. But as he reached the first floor, he stopped dead in his tracks. In the center of the living room, hovering above the floor, was a figure blacker than the night itself. It didn't move, only stared at him from beneath its hood, and an icy chill that pierced to the bone washed over James. "Old woman? Is that you?" he whispered, though he already knew he was wrong. The silence pressed against his ears, as if the entire house had stopped breathing. "I don't have time for your games," he yelled, trying to banish the fear. "You told me to destroy this house, and I will. I'll burn it to the ground." The figure lifted its head and a voice emerged. Not a human voice, but something born of 1,000 souls screaming in unison. A sound like the gates of hell itself cracking open. "You will not," the voice thundered, ripping through reality and making the walls tremble. James felt his legs weaken, and the hair on his head stood on end. "Who are you?" he stammered, gripping the gas canister so tightly his fingers turned white. "I am the one who will not allow the curse to be broken," the figure declared, its voice deepening into a terrible rumble, like thunder over a yawning chasm. "Tonight it will achieve its true power and consume everything around it." With those words, its hand shot out like lightning, and James was flung backward, slamming into the wall with such force that the breath was knocked from his lungs. The canister slipped from his grasp, hitting the floor and spilling gasoline in dark, thick streams. The figure paid it no mind. It turned to James and he froze. From beneath the hood, two blazing red eyes glared at him, glowing like embers, and beneath them emerged something no longer human. A wolf-like face twisted into a snarl, its mouth bristling with unnaturally long, sharp teeth, as though every part of it had been designed to tear flesh apart. Those burning eyes locked onto James, as if peering into the very depths of his soul. Fear nailed him to the floor. Every muscle in his body refused to move, yet his mind screamed at him to act. He could smell the stench of decay and damp moss wafting from the figure, and it took all his strength to suppress the nausea rising in his throat. "I can't let this thing destroy everything," he thought, clenching his fists in a desperate attempt to summon courage. "I might die, but this curse has to die with me." His hand trembled as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a lighter. The gasoline had already formed a large puddle on the floor, slowly creeping toward his feet. The figure stepped closer, and the stench of death became unbearable. "Not today, damn it," he muttered, flicking the lighter. A flame sprang to life, and without hesitation he tossed it into the pool of gasoline. The fire ignited instantly. Flames roared to life, shooting upward like a demon unleashed, bathing the room in a hellish red glow. The specter lunged toward the fire, its black cloak billowing as though battling an unseen force, but it couldn't approach. The flames spread too quickly, consuming everything in their path. Fiery tongues licked up the staircase, leaving charred black trails in their wake. Coughing from the thick smoke, James struggled to his feet. His head spun, his lungs burned, but he knew every step counted. He moved toward the exit, only for the figure to materialize before him, as if darkness itself had condensed into a human form. "You won't leave here alive!" it snarled, its voice now more of a growl, bestial and filled with rage. "You destroy the house, but it will be your tomb." "We'll see about that," James croaked, gritting his teeth. He made a desperate dash, hoping to slip past it, but an invisible force hurled him back against the wall. The impact was so hard that stars danced in his vision. Above him, something cracked loudly. James rolled to the side just in time as a ceiling beam crashed down, blocking the way to the door. The house was now an inferno, the crackling of burning wood merging with the ghost's unearthly howls in a symphony of chaos. Silhouette freezing for a moment before beginning to dissolve, like mist vanishing into the night. James's vision blurred, every breath searing his lungs as though he were inhaling fire. His eyes stung with tears from the acrid smoke, and the heat felt like it was peeling the skin off his body. Panic consumed him, flooding his senses like water filling the hull of a sinking ship. The door was engulfed in flames, the corridors choked with debris and burning wreckage. He knew there was no escape. It was a miracle he was still alive at all. Using the wall for support, James pushed himself up on trembling legs, fighting to stay upright. Then he saw it, the window. Salvation. Or, at least, a chance. Wrapping his head and hands with his jacket, he stumbled down the corridor, now a fiery dragon's maw, and lunged for the window. His fingers gripped the metal handle only to recoil with a yelp of pain. It was scorching hot. His lips pressed into a thin line. There was no time to hesitate. Balling his fist, he smashed the glass, shards raining down and cutting his skin. Shielding himself with his jacket, James dove through the jagged frame and landed on the lawn outside. Gasping for air, he lay sprawled on the grass, coughing up smoke and watching the flames devour the house. His hands trembled, his legs nearly useless. Eventually, he crawled to his car, collapsing beside it before darkness overtook him. When he woke, all was quiet. For a fleeting moment, he thought he was dead. But then he felt the softness beneath his back and the dry scratch of his parched throat. James opened his eyes to see a ceiling, not charred, but plain wood. He was lying on a couch in a cozy living room. Attempting to sit up, his head spun and he groaned, sinking back down. "Oh, James, you're awake," came a familiar voice, and the silhouette of an older man appeared above him. It was Matt, his neighbor. Beside him stood a woman, Matt's wife, with a kind face shadowed by concern. "We found you by your car. You were unconscious," Matt said, sitting beside him. "Thank you. Thank you for everything," James rasped, his voice hoarse and weak. "You were covered in soot and struggling to breathe, but thank God you're alive," Matt's wife said, her relief evident. "But your house, it burned to the ground. What happened?" James hesitated. He couldn't tell the truth. Curses, spirits, the bones of a dead boy. It would sound like madness. "The house was old," he finally said after a long pause. "I think the wiring shorted. It all happened so fast. I barely made it out." Matt nodded, seeming to accept the explanation. "I never liked that house anyway," James added. "Now I'll leave and never look back." Matt and his wife didn't press him further. They let him rest, gave him hot tea and a hearty breakfast, the first peaceful meal he'd had in days. Once his strength returned, James thanked them and returned to the ruins. One thought haunted him: the boy. He had to find his remains. Charred beams, ash, debris. Everything had collapsed into an unrecognizable heap. For hours, James sifted through the wreckage, his hands blackened with soot, but found nothing. They must have burned to ash, he thought. Exhaustion and relief mixing in an odd cocktail of emotions. The house was gone. The curse was lifted. Rising to his feet, James brushed off the dust and looked at what remained of the accursed building. The charred walls jutted upward like jagged teeth from the gum of the ruined ground. "Rest in peace, kid," he whispered, turning his back on the ruins. He got into his car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. The chapter was closed, but the shadow of memory lingered. The whispers of the house as it crumbled to ash, and the inhuman scream of the creature he'd destroyed echoed in his ears. James hoped he'd never hear that sound again.